Good evening. I am Janie Herman, the manager of adult programming, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here to the library tonight for our talk. Before we get going, I'm going to just do a few housekeeping items. So please note that this room is equipped with a hearing loop that pairs with T-coil technology devices. If you need hearing assistance, we do have T-coil headphones for your use. Just raise your hand and I can run you over a pair. We kindly ask that you silence electronic devices and that you hold your questions until the end, as there will be a chance for Q&A at that time. Finally, we'd like to extend our thanks to Labyrinth Books, as always, for being our bookseller tonight. Books will be for sale after the event during the signing. So tonight we have Lawrence Ingrassia and joined by Arnold Levine to discuss his memoir, A Fatal Inheritance, How a Family Misfortune Revealed a Deadly Medical Mystery. You know what, I should have checked before I got up here to introduce, and I do, but we had so much activity going on. Arnold, did I say your last name right? It is Levine?
Yes.
Correct, great. He is Professor Emeritus at the Institute for Advanced Study here in Princeton, New Jersey, where Einstein once worked, as we were just talking about a moment ago. He is a renowned scientist who has won numerous awards for his groundbreaking research, including work on cancer genetics that helped deepen the understanding of hereditary syndromes. So he is the perfect moderator for tonight's talk, as you can see, with Lawrence Ingrassia, an award-winning journalist, now retired, who worked as a senior editor at the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Los Angeles Times. His book, A Fatal Inheritance, How Family Misfortune Revealed a Deadly Medical Mystery, was one of the top 10 books on the long list for the prestigious National Book Critics Circle Award for 2024. In nonfiction category. He was also selected for a number of other Best of the Year lists, including NPR's Books We Love, Amazon's Best Nonfiction Books of 2024, Kirkus Review's Best Nonfiction, and BookPage Best Audiobooks of 2024. So I'm really delighted to welcome you both here to the library. And with that, I will let you both take it away for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and for agreeing to host this. And also wanted to thank my friend, former colleague Sylvia Ascarelli, who suggested that if I was ever getting back to New York, I live in the Seattle area, that maybe I should come down here. And I'm so happy to be here and see a bunch of, so many of you. I don't know many of you, but I do have some old friends, in addition to Sylvia, in the audience. Including Peter Kahn and Karen House, two of the most distinguished journalists of our generation, who we learned so much from. So thank you, and other colleagues, friends from the Journal, Larry Root, Greg Corcoran, and there was a colleague from the New York Times, David Gill, thank you for coming. And then thank you, Arnie, for doing this. So we'll get into a little bit about his research as we talk about the book, but Arnie is really one of the most distinguished cancer researchers of the past half century. He's a giant whose contributions into helping the understanding of cancer and the causes of cancer just, you can't say too much about it. So, and also he helped me during the book, and I'll tell a little anecdote, you publish a book. I'm a business writer by, background, not science, and so I had to learn this stuff when I wrote it. And so I published a book, and, you always said, did I get it right? And the day after the book was published, I got an email from Arnie, and I was like, should I open this up or whatever? What is he going to say? Because it's like, oh, you got this wrong. And it was really a beautiful note, it said, that he really enjoyed the book and had read it in one sitting. And it just meant a lot to me to hear that, as an author who's always a little bit worried. I wanted to read just a quick, a few paragraphs from the book. So, some of you in the audience know my family story, others don't. Many families are touched by cancer, including, I'm sure, many of yours. A handful seem especially cursed, and mine is one of them. So my mother first had cancer in her 30s, breast cancer, and she died at 42. I had two younger sisters, one who died of 24, one at 32, both of different cancers. My nephew, Charlie, had his first cancer at age 2, survived that, and he also survived his second cancer at age 30. And my brother had his first cancer at 46, Paul, and died of cancer about his fifth or sixth, depending on what you count, at age 69. So with that, just as kind of a brief introduction, I wanted to read about Charlie getting his third cancer diagnosis when he was, I think he was 38 at the time. And of course, kind of initially, and it was a bone cancer. It was in his hip, and he was undergoing, kind of a combination of, it was chemotherapy, radiation. He didn't want to have because that could cause even more cancers. Charlie's new chemo didn't work. Surgeons scheduled an operation for October 31st, advising Charlie that there was a chance they would be able to remove the tumor, but most likely they would have to amputate his leg and hip. Not getting out all the cancer would be a short-term death sentence. After all the suffering Charlie had gone through, from his childhood cancer, which was in his cheek, to his many reconstructive surgeries, to colorectal cancer, to his hip cancer now, this was almost too much even to contemplate. As the day of the surgery approached, Paul, my brother, wrote, "This is the big show. There is no getting around it, so we might as well get on with it." When I talked to my brother on the telephone the day before Charlie's surgery, he sobbed several times. The surgery began at 8 a.m. and didn't end until an exhausting 9 hours later at nearly 5 p.m. The tumor was so large that the surgeons, as they had forewarned, had no choice but to take Charlie's leg and hip. I cried when my brother called with the news. More than the rest of us, Charlie had braced himself for the worst, and he took in the news stoically when he woke up from the anesthesia 90 minutes after the operation. Then, no doubt wanting a small bit of normalcy, Charlie, a devoted Chicago Cubs fan, insisted on watching the sixth game of the World Series between the Dodgers and the Houston Astros. The next morning, he emailed friends. "Losing the leg is tough, but I view it as a new beginning rather than a loss of a limb. As I told my parents, I will adapt and all will be good." Even with powerful drugs, he would be in a lot of pain and for a long time. Still, Charlie now had a chance. But while Charlie was doing rehab and continued to undergo chemotherapy, a scan in February detected a tiny spot on his lung, and a biopsy confirmed that it was malignant, most likely an offshoot of the bone tumor. It seemed a minor setback as the tumor began shrinking after doctors prescribed an oral take-it-home drug. Still, despite everything, his hard work, it was looking like it was paying off. For weeks after surgery, he could stand for only a brief period, and he began slowly building his strength and walking on crutches, initially around his condo and then for short distances outside. In early May, he walked around the block on his crutches. For most of us, that is an everyday event we don't even think about. For Charlie, it was a monumental achievement, something he hadn't managed to do for months. He started working a few days a week from home, writing briefs on legal cases. He was a lawyer. And by May, he was fit enough to go into the office. He seemed to be making a remarkable recovery, and why not? Hadn't he always? But nothing seemed to keep the tumors from spreading for long. By early 2019, Charlie was in a fight for survival. And Paul and his wife Susan were desperate to try anything and everything. They'd heard of a relatively new and very expensive immunotherapy drug called Keytruda, which works by helping a patient's immune system recognize and fight cancer cells. The drug wasn't a cure for cancer, but clinical trials found that it modestly improved survival rates. When Charlie's insurance company balked at covering the cost, he filed an appeal, but feeling they couldn't wait for an answer, Paul and Sue paid out of pocket $17,500 for the initial dose. Those next two doses were provided free on a compassionate basis in a desperate effort to save their son. Even as his condition deteriorated, Charlie remained characteristically optimistic. In early February, he told a cousin visiting him, "I just know I will hear the words, 'Your cancer is cured.'" He renewed his Chicago Cubs tickets package that he shared with friends. A week later, early in the morning of February 17th, I was awakened by a call from my brother. Choked up, Paul could barely get out the words, "He's gone." My brother died 7 months after that, because his pancreatic cancer, which he thought that he had beat, came back in his lung. And I felt I wanted to tell this story. I didn't know anything about it when I started my research. I knew that there was a gene. I didn't know anything about the gene that was meant to prevent cancer that didn't in my family because there was a mutation. And I began this journey. It was a journey of discovery. It was a journey of connection. And it was thanks to a lot of people like Arnie, who helped me understand the academic papers to be able to say. And I wanted to tell just kind of a story about science and the way science is done and how halting and slow it is. Starts in late 60s, and you probably were a young scientist then, where two doctors, Li and Fraumeni, kind of came across a family, not my family, but a family where a father and son, kind of had cancer. The father was 23 years old, had leukemia. His son was 10 months old and had a soft tissue. And it was so unusual, they decided to study his family, and they found it was riddled with cancers for generations. But it wasn't until late 1990, November, December 1990, that they finally found the gene. It was like a 20-year kind of trek.
1979 was the finding of the gene, but it took another 10 years
to connect the gene.
To connect the gene to the Li-Fraumeni syndrome,
And Arnie kind of helped find the gene in the first place, P53, but didn't know what it was for.
That's right. That's why it's slow and halting, I have to say. It's ironic because when you sent me the book, when it was first written, I read it, as I said, cover to cover all night, and was really taken with it, I have to say. Because it's been so much of my life, actually, is to meet the families and to work on the gene that actually causes this terrible disaster. And it was ironic because I got here a little early, and I took my copy of the book, and I went in the back, and I realized that I hadn't read the book for quite some time. So I better, and for some reason, I went to the chapter, the end of the story where you talked about your brother and your nephew. And that I know from the book hurt a lot. And it's that which drives, I think, all the scientists. So it may be worthwhile to know that the gene, what happened was Li and Fraumeni, Frederick Li was at Dana-Farber Cancer Center. And Joe Fraumeni was at the National Institutes of Health. And they're epidemiologists. Their job is to find out what's happening in the world of cancer that could cause the cancer, right? And they found this family, and then they found another family, and then another family, which fairly rare cancers were coming up. This rhabdomyosarcoma is a cancer of the muscle tissue. It's fairly rare, and it's practically non-existent in a 2-year-old, and yet it was coming up.
It was not only in this baby, he had two cousins.
Yes.
Who had the same type of cancer at different times, but also as infants.
Right.
So talk about, kind of unusual.
Right.
And the other interesting thing is so they kind of came across these families and they write a paper because they say, oh my God, there's all these cancers. Is there something familiar? You have to go back to the 60s. Very little known was about heredity in cancer. In fact, the prevailing theory, which I didn't realize until I started doing my research, is that the belief was that most cancers were caused by viruses.
That's right.
A few are, some 10, 15%, but not most. Anyway, so they write this paper, and they say, we came across this family. It's fascinating, and all these, like 6 generations, really this family was totally riddled with cancer, all different kinds of cancers. And they write this paper, and they expect, some recognition or whatever, and the Cancer Research Establishment basically said, we think you're wrong. There's a lot of skepticism. Okay, why? These cancers are unrelated. It can't possibly, have a hereditary or familial syndrome in common. And second, it could be a virus. And they had tested tissues to find a virus, but they hadn't had any success. Well, it doesn't mean just because you found it, you don't know what you're looking for. Maybe and the other thing is, well, it might be environmental. Just something environmental that you don't know. And, they had considered all these things, and that's why they still thought that maybe it was something, because on the environmental, this was a family that was kind of, at this point, was a sprawling family. They lived in different parts of the state. So it wasn't like they all lived in the same town next to a smelter, for example. That would be, kind of give you, kind of reason to think it. So they were told, there's a lot of skepticism. Of course, they couldn't prove it. But to their credit, they persevered. They said, we're going to keep following this family and other families. And that was, kind of the genesis of what eventually became, kind of the solving of the medical mystery.
Yeah, at the time it wasn't called Li Fraumeni syndrome because you never named something after yourself. So it was, but it was Li and Fraumeni that worked hard, seriously hard. And it was the scientific skepticism that pushed them. That's the thing that, and the skepticism was, if it's inherited, it has to have a gene. So what's the gene, right? And then at the same time, in the 1960s, there were mice that had inherited cancers, leukemias and other kinds of cancers, sarcomas. And those mice turned out to have viruses that did that. So that was the skepticism. The skepticism was accelerated by the fact that there were a whole group of people working on viruses, and they believed viruses cause cancer, and it wasn't inherited.
Right.
And so they struggled. Li and Fraumeni deserved to have that.
Did you know them kind of in this?
Oh, yeah.
When did you finally kind of?
Well, I met Fraumeni at NIH, actually, in a talk I gave at NIH.
In the 70s?
Yes. Yeah, in the 70s. I gave a talk on P53, but it was before we realized that we are cousins, that we were really related in some funny way. So 69 was the time. And then in 79, of course, having said that viruses are caused by cancer, I was to blame too. I was working on a virus. And I was working, and of all things, scientists choose the best system. So I was working on a monkey virus that caused cancer in hamsters, all right? Now that is a little strange to begin with if you think about it. And what we found was, we found the P53 gene. By that, the tumors, right?
Had the P53.
Had the P53 gene. And it was associated with the gene in the virus that caused the cancer. It was combined with it, really associated with it. And all of us thought that was going to be important.
Yes, right.
And then the exact same thing happened. To Li and Fraumeni, happened to me, and then I should say, the P53 gene was found in several places. It was found in Paris, it was found in London, it was found in New York, and Little Princeton. Right? and so there were 4 groups that found the Li Fraumeni gene right away. Not the Li Fraumeni gene, but the P53 gene. Now, it's strange to call something P53, right? I mean, that's like code. And we named it that simply because we had no idea what it did. And so we gave it its molecular weight. It was 53,000 hydrogen atoms, and we gave it its molecular weight, which we could tell as we isolated it. And then we started working on it. And there again, an extremely strange thing happened that was cute, actually, but strange. And it cost us many years, right? The first thing you do when you have a protein called P53 that binds to an oncogene that's causing the cancer, right? The first thing you do is say, I want to find the gene for this protein, right? And in 1979, cloning a gene was a 2 to 3 year enterprise.
The other thing kind of I found fascinating is just kind of the tool, not only does the understanding of heredity, kind of genetics was much more rudimentary back then, but the tools to actually kind of study genes were very rudimentary back then. You couldn't do what's called gene splicing back then to actually kind of look into a gene and to identify, kind of, so it's like being in a room that's dark, you can't see anything, and you're kind of searching around for it. You don't know what you're searching for. So that was the other, there was a whole decade where we had to kind of understand genetics. And also, then you had a decade where you needed to develop the tools once you had started to have an understanding. And throughout this whole time, kind of Family A, which was the focus of a lot of my research, because they were the focus of a lot of the research, kind of their Li and Fraumeni are kind of tracking this family, and they're having more and more cancers. All different kinds of cancers, again, young ages, kind of really wiping out a lot of that. There were 3 sisters in one branch of that family, kind of all of them died of cancer, kind of at fairly early ages. Again, different kinds of cancers. So they were kind of, we're not going to give up. We're confident that something is going on here, but we don't know still, kind of what is going on. And, kind of this family's going through a lot of anguish. The thing kind of, which is I found interesting. So if you look at my family, my mother died in 68. Interesting, kind of very parallel, just a year before the first paper was published. The next cancer wasn't for another decade. It was, kind of 1980, kind of when my sister got cancer and she died, 6 months later, 81. Then my nephew got it a year later, and then my other sister, kind of another 6 years later, and then my brother, kind of 8 years later. I mean, so it turns out that, kind of even in cancer-prone families, I think this is why you can't speed up the research to some extent. It's a little bit hard if you're studying these families. Kind of, you can't, they're sporadic, and they're different kinds of cancers. So it takes a while for them to build up. If you're really kind of statistically trying to show it, you have a hard time. Kind of, you just have to be patient. That's the patience that I kind of found with kind of
So
science.
It took us as a field, not me and not my lab, but a whole field, 10 years to find out the functions of P53 gene. And the functions were that it was called a tumor suppressor gene.
But initially you thought it was because you thought it was an oncogene. They thought it caused cancer.
The cause of cancer.
It was the opposite of what it did.
Exactly. And so it turned out to be a tumor suppressor gene. That means all of us have this gene, and it helps us prevent cancers from arising.
Everybody knows about BRCA, the BRCA gene.
Yeah.
Okay. But the BRCA gene is mainly a tumor suppressor gene.
No, it is. That's right.
That for breast cancer and ovarian cancer.
Yes.
And there are other types of tumor suppressor genes which are mostly site-specific.
Right.
So why were there all these different cancers all over the body? P53 is not site-specific.
That's right. So
P53 protects cancer throughout the body if you have healthy P53. But if it's mutated,
that's right. And that's it.
It doesn't protect it anywhere in the body.
You lose the tumor suppression. You lose the ability to prevent the cancer. And it's not that you instantaneously get cancer. The babies are born perfectly fine, right? It's that you get a predilection to get cancer. And
because you have a mutation already.
Right. It's just like BRCA in that sense, except this is a little bit more advanced than BRCA in the sense that breast cancer is a very good example. BRCA breast cancers tend to be in the 40s to 60-year-old women. P53 cancers in breast cancer tend to be between the ages of 20 and 40. Very young. And the median age is about 33.
And there are a lot of young, kind of other kinds of cancer at very young ages.
Yeah.
So it turns out, kind of, again, I didn't know any of this when I got into it. When I started my research, P53 has subsequently been dubbed the guardian of the genome because it's so important. It's become the single most studied gene in the human body. Kind of 20, 30,000 academic papers have been written about it.
140,000.
Okay.
To be exact.
It keeps going up rapidly. If you have the inherited P53 mutation, by age 40, there's a 50% chance that you'll have cancer and multiple cancers if you survived your first cancer. That's versus 5% of cancer in the overall population by age 40. There's a 95% chance that you'll have cancer in your lifetime if you have the P53 inherited mutation. Now, the discovery of P53 was huge, not just in the scientific world, but kind of in the general press. So the New York Times did a front page, 2-column headline above the fold. The Wall Street Journal had a very big story by, kind of its top medical reporters. One of them named Mike Waltz, who would go on to share a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of AIDS. And my brother and I both worked for the Wall Street Journal, senior editors at the time. I don't recall us ever kind of talking about that story. It's kind of amazing. And so kind of as I reflected on that, just kind of how did we kind of ignore that? So our father had been a research chemist, and we had long kind of convinced ourselves, absent any proof, but of course there was no proof of what caused cancer, we had long convinced ourselves that, he had brought home tiny particles of carcinogenic chemicals on his clothing, then ingested somehow, years later resulting in cancer. So that was one reason why we just never, and no doctors, partly because Li Fraumeni was, even oncologists was so rare, and these cancers seemingly related, none of them said, oh, by the way, it actually might be something genetic. And there was another reason that we didn't have the suspicion. So I mentioned that this family A, which I was able to track down, get the records, found family members, and talk to them about all that family, kind of Li and Fraumeni built a family tree that went back, to, the late 1800s of the cancers in this family. It was truly riddled. There were no cancers in my family, until my mother. Both of her parents lived into their 80s and never had cancer. And her only sister, her only sibling, lived into her 80s, never had cancer. So I was like, that was another reason we didn't suspect, or maybe doctors didn't suspect, oh, they've got this. Because if you had a hereditary, you'd think you would find a long history. And when I was doing the research, I finally said to Joe Fraumeni, who's still alive, and he's kind of in his early 90s. Fred Lee died in 2015. I said, what is that? And he says, He said, well, kind of 5 to 10% of cases of hereditary cancer are de novo. And I said, like, explain that to me. He says, well, it's not inherited in the genes. For the mutation is inherited. It is when you're conceived with the mutation. And from that point on, that's when you can then pass it on. So the other question that I had was, I've never been sick in my life. It's kind of crazy. My siblings, kind of all died. My mother, kind of my son. And I actually have never been I've been in hospitals a lot, and I've had minor procedures. I've never spent a night in the hospital for a medical condition myself. I'm like, kind of fortunately one of the healthiest people that I know, kind of wears some wood, kind of I can go, kind of knock on, kind of, so why have I been spared? Kind of what was it? Again, science was explained to me. If you, kind of with the mutation like this, there's a 50-50 chance that you will inherit the mutation. And so in late 2014, I got a call from my brother. I was at the New York Times at this point, and he called me and he said, my oncologist has suggested that I actually get tested for this gene called P53 that is meant to prevent cancer, and kind of you had the mutation, then it kind of that may be the cause of the cancers in our family. It was the first time I had heard of it, and he mentioned Li Fraumeni, and so I actually kind of typed an email that I sent to myself, so I know exactly when he called, and kind of was able to describe that in the book. I typed it to myself, so I'll go back and look at that later, which kind of figure out what this is, and I never did. But so sure enough, he got tested. Within a month, he found out, kind of that he was positive, and he said, actually, I feel a bit relieved about that. We now finally know what the thing is. And I didn't get tested immediately. I was in my early 60s. I figured if I was going to get cancer, and I guess I've always been a little fatalistic, it was going to happen, it was going to happen. And finally, my daughter said, you know what, I really want you to get tested. And so I decided. So it turns out, kind of there's a 5% chance that you have inherited the mutation, but don't have cancer. Nobody knows why, but that's kind of what it is. And so kind of there was a chance that I had inherited it. And if I had inherited, I could pass it on even though I didn't have cancer. So I decided to go get tested. Kind of in 2000, and it was probably early 2016, I think, at that time. Back then, a genetic test would cost like $3,000 to $5,000. So Paul, kind of asked his doctor, do you know of any studies? I was living in LA at the time. And he said, do you know any studies that are being done? And sure enough, there was a study kind of having to do with Li Fraumeni syndrome that was being done at University of Southern California. And so I was able to go and get the test done free as part of a study. Now, an aside is that, kind of a genetic test, a multi-panel genetic test for a lot of different kind of cancer genes would cost $250. I mean, that's how the science has improved. And so, and I tested negative. So I don't have to worry kind of about my family now. Kind of I couldn't have passed it on only if. And you had a question about my getting the negative test.
Yeah, so it's very interesting because as you can see from the story, it's quite an interesting story if you think about it. You don't want to be tested because you just, manage to get through life, right? But then a daughter or a son who says, hey, if this is inherited, you better be tested, right? And so the pressure starts to build to do it, and you get tested. And then what happens is that the people who don't have these mutations, the individuals, often feel guilty. How is it that my brother and my nephew got the gene? I mean, your brother had the same parents, and how is it that you didn't? It's random association of chromosomes at the time.
50%.
That's right, 50-50. Completely random. Right?
So in some of the families that I talked to, there was kind of understandably tension. Kind of there were some family members like, kind of, do you think of it, kind of one branch is riddled and their children have cancer and the other branch is like totally healthy. And it was, kind of sometimes the people on the kind of who were, had all the cancers were, these are feelings you can't control. We're angry. Why me?
That's
kind
right.
of, why not you? Kind of, kind of, this is not fair.
Right.
And it's not. And, kind of, I think when Arnie and I were talking beforehand, and I kind of address it a little bit in the book, but other people have asked me too, kind of, do you feel survivor's guilt? And so, kind of, if I do, kind of, it's not like a strong survivor's guilt. And I think there are two reasons for that. Kind of one, I guess I'm just rational. I knew it was kind of 50-50 chance. As I explain it to people, if God had said, okay, you get to choose which, it's going to be 50-50 in your family, you get to choose which of the family members get it and which don't, and I said, not me, my sister, my brothers, then I would have a role in making that decision, and I think that would be kind of reason for guilt. Just because I was, kind of, but I didn't have any choice in that. It was just random genetics. But I have to say, I know some of the people in the audience know my brother. When I sent him the genetics test, my results, I think he was living in London at the time. I was in LA, so I didn't call him. I just kind of shot off an email saying, hey, here's the result of my genetic test. It's negative. And almost instantly, I got back a message from him. It had two words: great news, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. And I think if the action had been something different, I might have had, but kind of that was the kind of relationship that we had, and I think he was joyful, he was happy. He knew that, kind of we were going to be spared this thing that, kind of he, kind of in his branch had not been spared. And our, kind of sisters, it wasn't just, so I think that kind of helped a lot. And I think in some families, kind of it's hard to do that. And I would have understood if he had said, why me?
Yeah.
But it was, kind of that instantaneous, kind of love that I got, kind of in support that I got was.
The other reason that I think people feel guilt is you grew up in a family that had cancer all around you. You saw the horrors and the tragedies of that. and then yours bad, right? And so it really is tough. One of the questions that comes up at Li, we have meetings of the Li Fraumeni Association, Syndrome Association, and patients come to those meetings. They're scientists, they're clinicians, and they're patients, right?
Yeah.
And one of the questions, there are 100 questions that come up from the patients. And one of them that strikes me as very hard is, at what age do I tell my children,
Yeah.
right?
What age do I test them?
Or what
Some
age
cases.
do I test them? At what age do I tell them they're in a family, right? That has a chance, right? And because you can have childhood cancer with Li Fraumeni.
You know, in some ways, I think almost we were, even though these cancers are happening sporadically, you know, kind of maybe we were lucky not knowing that the gene was in the family because we weren't kind of always expecting. If you have this mutation, it's not if you're going to get cancer. It's when and how often and where.
Yeah.
But so we didn't have that kind of sitting over us all the time. It was just like, oh, this is like, you know, kind of bad luck or whatever. It's not, you know, kind of. So
the numbers are available now. The families are being collected all over the world. This is not a United States thing. Families all over the world are being collected.
There's no ethnicity or nationality kind of
ethnicity,
with the P53
and
mutation.
the people who come to the meetings, you can see that.
Yeah,
right. And so the collection is in a large database, right? And there are some mutations which are called pathogenic because they have a high incidence of the cancer. There are other mutations which are called hypopathogenic, hypo being less pathogenic, and there's less cancer in the family. Well, that's good because we can know that and look and things, right?
But we still don't know exactly why.
Yeah, but if you do the statistics, the most common cancer in Li Fraumeni families is breast cancer.
Yeah, right.
It's
More common than with the BRCA gene percentage.
That's correct.
Yeah, right. Which is
so it's quite amazing. Males have more cancer than females. That's in the general population. Males live shorter time, but they have more cancers than females, right? And yet, in Li Fraumeni families, females have more cancers than anybody else because of breast cancer. And the penetrance, which is how much of the group will get breast cancer with a pathogenic allele, is 90%. So women will opt for double mastectomies early on to get rid of this very high percentage. The probabilities are high. So knowing the numbers, once you have information, the scientific information, you really get better and better medicine.
Right. Why don't we just kind of open up and see people kind of want to ask questions about, you know, kind of Arnie or me about the research about my family, about how I kind of, kind of dug into this other family and learned about them.
Okay, just raise your hand and I'll run you the microphone if you have a question. Okay, right here.
I'm just curious, how does AI enter into the research that's being done currently?
So I'm going to let him answer that specifically. Interestingly, kind of this genetic mutation linking it to these cancers in these families, late 1990. I mean, it's like 30-some years ago, right?
That's right.
So it's like, why haven't we made progress? Well, in some ways, we have made a lot of progress. You know, kind of the survival rates in a lot of cancers has increased dramatically, and partly because of the understanding of cancer from understanding how P53 and cancer suppressor genes work. So kind of, and be able to use that to develop targeted cancers. But there is no cure for a mutation, you know, kind of right now. Kind of, they're hoping someday with CRISPR technology, which is a gene editing technique, that they'll be going in and like with a word processor, kind of get out the word that you've misspelled. You kind of go in and you fix the gene. That's 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. I mean, who knows? I think someday you have to have hope that it's going to happen because otherwise these families don't have much hope. Right now, the best treatment for people with Li Fraumeni syndrome, you have regular screening so that you catch the cancers early. And that means, like, you know, if you're a child, you're starting, you know, kind of every 3, 6 months or year, you're kind of going through, you know, all sorts of scans and everything to try to catch it. But, you know, kind of, I think AI is kind of an interesting thing.
I'll answer AI, but there's also, there's a way to avoid this, but it's a complex way. Anyhow, let's start with
IVF is basically the way to kind of avoid it and test and throw out the...
You can test an embryo.
Throw out the embryos that have the mutation and keep the embryos that don't have the mutation.
Fertilized in a test tube.
Yeah.
And then you take one cell and you look for the gene. And it has either a mutation or not. And that embryo is destroyed or that embryo is implanted, depending on what the answer is. So you can get a family and break out the whole generations of past by in vitro fertilization. But let me answer the AI question, because actually this experiment's going on right now in this way. First of all, you know already that AI needs an enormous amount of information. So we have to have databases of information that are enormous. And fortunately, we're starting to get them. I'll give you an example. There's something called the British Biobank. In Great Britain, of course, medicine is socialized. So everybody goes to a central place. Their records are all available on a computer, and all the codes are the same. And so you really can manipulate them. It's not like two different hospitals that can't talk to each other. Right? So what the British Biobank did, which was very clever, I thought, was they took people in the Great Britain population. They just did a distribution that allowed for them to look at very many kinds of people in Great Britain that are in the healthcare system. And they took 500,000 of these people and they sequenced their DNA. Not only the P53 gene, but the whole shebang.
Anonymized.
Yes,
anonymized,
that's right.
Yep.
No, it's all anonymized, yes. But so they have numbers. You deal with numbers there, not people. And then their records are linked to the numbers, right? So you have a whole history of people, and now you could ask the question: are there obvious Li Fraumeni families that have cancer in the British Biobank, and how many and how frequently are they, and so forth and so on, right? So that gave us this information that said, oh, if you have Li Fraumeni families and you're going to get breast cancer, you have about 90% chance. You're going to get some other tumor, it's less of a chance, and so forth. And that there are hypomorphic alleles and pathogenic alleles. So you can really tease from a large database any question you want to ask, right? And now, it would be wonderful that the same thing has been done in China, but that's not publicly available, unfortunately. And so it would be wonderful to take a look at that comparison, if we can, because the question of what does race have an impact upon the Li Fraumeni gene, right? Because there are differences in different racial groups. African Americans have different kinds of cancers than Caucasians do, than European Americans, right?
Other questions?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, yeah, right over here.
I kind of would have a couple of questions, but the first one that I wanted to ask you was, the mutation started with your mom.
Yes.
Did you go back any further in your mom?
No, kind of, this is the assumption of the doctors kind of talking to. And, you know, kind of, we don't know for certain that my sisters had either, but if you look at, you know, kind of the genetic record, and it's my brother had to inherit it.
So only your brother and you were tested out of your family? Your mom wasn't tested, your dad
There was no
wasn't
testing.
tested?
They didn't know what they wouldn't, she died in 1968.
Yeah,
Kind of,
yeah.
my other sisters died in 81 and early 81 and 87. So that was before there was any, you know, kind of testing. That was before the mutation was linked to that.
Did you ever analyze, though, your mom's family further back? Like you said, the family A for Li Fraumeni was analyzed back into the 1800s, but what
I didn't, because nobody in the family told me that there was any history of cancer going back. I would have had to go back to Italy, you know, kind of to do that research, and kind of getting those medical records would have been.
And both your mom and dad were Sicilian from Italy, or kind of?
yes, kind of, southern Italy, yeah, right, yeah. And my father, kind of, he was one of 7, and there wasn't any cancer in his family, so that's why and he died early, but he had a heart condition, didn't have anything to do with cancer, so it had to be, my mother kind of giving the early onset breast cancer in the 30s and died at 42. I mean, if you look at all the patterns.
There are
One other thing before I forget, though, you said that it's random, you get the mutation, yet all of your sisters had.
It's a 50-50 chance, but statistically.
It's 50-50 each time.
Right, so you're yes
So
or no.
rolling the dice each time, yeah,
You're yes or no.
that's right.
I mean, the overall population, it's going to work out to
Right,
50-50,
that's
but
right.
in one family, you might have
Thousands of people.
all the children
Yeah, that's right.
who get it, but,
Yeah.
kind of another family, you might have 1 out of 3 or 4.
Let me say 2 things about your question. One is, in back couple of generations, when people had cancer, they never talked about it, right? In families, they wouldn't speak about it. And so you would never know or your mother would never know, right?
I think
That's
one of the
thing.
reasons
But the second is,
not necessarily, no,
No,
not necessarily.
no. Yeah, but the second thing is, it's very likely his mother had a spontaneous mutation sometime during either when an egg was fertilized, right? So either came from one or the other, but it's spontaneous.
Yeah.
Right? We know now if I was to take a father, a mother, and an offspring and sequence all of the genetic information, there'd be 60 mutations that come from the mother and about 90 that come from the father.
But most of them are benign.
Oh yeah,
kind of
you have 25,000 genes.
Yeah, right. Kind of,
and most of the genome is not even coding, right?
Yeah.
So no, it's rare that it would be P53, but there are a lot of births.
Yeah.
Anybody else with a question?
Yeah, there's one here in front. Yeah. Try.
Are there other suppressor genes related to specific diseases?
There are about 50 or more, I mean, actually a lot of suppressor genes. So, kind of one of the things I read, there's a chapter in my book about Lynch syndrome. So there was another doctor around the same time as Li and Fraumeni and he was in Nebraska, and he came across all these families that had colon cancer. And again, he kind of wrote papers suggesting there might be something hereditary, and because he was from Nebraska, kind of the kind of people on the coast said, what does this guy know about genetics? Again, there was part of the feeling, it's like, if the thing is meant to be discovered, we would be discovering it, not you guys who kind of really are newcomers to this field. And so but of course he turns out, kind of that turns out to be true, kind of as well. There's an eye gene,
Retinoblastoma.
retinoblastoma, kind of, kind of that causes often kind of early onset, kind of eye cancer in children.
That's right.
In infants.
At birth.
At birth, yes, right. So they have discovered subsequently a whole slew of, in fact, the breast cancer BRCA gene was discovered in 94,
Yeah.
I think. So,
Yeah,
but most of
about
them are site specific.
Let me give you an example of a tumor suppressor gene, because you'll see. Just going through life, your genetic information becomes damaged, right? You could be living next to a plant that spewed something bad. You could be eating something. Pesticides. You can name them. There's a large number of things that damage our DNA. Every day we have damaged DNA. And so evolution has given us a gift to repair the damage. And these are called DNA repair genes. And almost every gene we talked about that is BRCA is a DNA repair gene. And P53 surveils, it watches over all the DNA repair genes, right? That's why it's so central. But so there are a lot of tumor suppressors. Evolution has given us a chance to live a long life and to reproduce. That's what evolution would like.
The other thing, Larry, kind of cancer is a disease of the aging usually. Yes. So kind of, if somebody's getting cancer when they're 60 or 70, that's kind of not abnormal. That's kind of normal because, again, we have millions of cells. They're kind of trillions. They're dividing all the time in most of the divisions, and occasionally they're mutating, but most of the mutations are benign. And occasionally there's a few of the mutations that are potentially cancerous, potentially malignant, but the cancer suppressor gene kind of repairs it or kills it. I mean, these are kind of evolutionary. It's kind of a miracle, right?
Yes.
That you've kind of developed this. But if you think over a lifetime, by your 60 or 70, how many kind of trillions of mutations you have, and then, the cancer suppressor gene doesn't fix that one, and then you get cancer. And that's why it's kind of, so over time, the odds of getting cancer just increase.
Yeah, we're a very long-lived species, and we're getting longer because of good health and things. And the way we live a long time is that our cells turn over. For example, in your gut, every 4 days you turn over the cells in your gut, and every 30 days in your blood, right? That means by turnover, they're synthesized, and then they're killed. So all this damage also gets all
Washed
those
out of the
genes
system.
gets washed out of the system, right? So this idea, the idea of having organisms that are constantly regenerating themselves, right? Which really, amphibians do much better than us. They can regenerate arms and legs, but that we constantly regenerate all the cells of our organs.
Larry,
Yes.
sorry to show my ignorance, but how do you get tested for a gene? Is it a blood test? They take a piece out of you? What do they do?
It is a blood test.
Yes.
It's a blood test now.
The most, you could take it, I could take a swab of your cheek and I'd get some cells. That would be good. I just need cells. So some people take blood tests. In the case of Li and Fraumeni syndrome nowadays, you would do 3 tissues, right? This is an interesting part of Li and Fraumeni, right? You would get a swab in the cheek, you would get a piece of your hair, that get a hair follicle, and you would get blood. And the reason is that you could be a mosaic. If a mutation arose while you were developing, only certain parts of your body would get a bad P53 gene.
Kind of the test, kind of it's interesting because, again, it's developed over time. One of the things Li and Fraumeni were very prescient in doing, when they started studying these families, they took tissue samples, kind of going, before they actually kind of knew what to before you could test for a genetic mutation, they were testing for viruses, but they kept those tissues. So kind of going 20 years forward, they had from this family and from some other families, because you wouldn't want to base a finding on just one family. So it's interesting that they kind of tested. In 1981 or 82, when my nephew and Paul's son Charlie had cancer, and this was the only time we were at the Cleveland. He was living in Cleveland. We were at the Cleveland Children's. There was a children's clinic there, hospital, and because we told a little bit about the cancer in our families. Our sister had just died, and our other sister didn't have cancer yet. I actually have a scar on my kind of, so there was a skin snip that was taken. And I don't think they knew it. They couldn't do a genetic test. They were looking for abnormal growth, and they didn't find anything. And so it was just, but they were just kind of searching. That was the only suggestion ever that, kind of we're looking for something, but we didn't know. And I guess we just kind of forgot about it and didn't think much about it because nothing was
I
found.
don't know if this is actually in your book. I'm trying to remember. That about 400 years ago, roughly 300 or 400 years ago, a Portuguese sailor.
Yeah, that is.
It is, yeah. Portuguese sailor landed in Brazil. And he and his 2 sons had Li and Fraumeni syndrome. And
We assume.
Yes.
Statistically, we can.
They have Portuguese genes, right? So we could tell that was from Portugal, right? So we know around the mutation there are typical Portuguese and Spanish genes, right? So the Portuguese sailors made it a lot, and that gave rise to an unbelievable epidemic of cancer south of Sao Paulo, right? So 1 in 300 people, now we said 1 in 5,000 in the United States, 1 in 300 people in southern Brazil have Li and Fraumeni syndrome. And they all have the exact same mutation.
Okay, so now.
That comes from this Portuguese sailor.
Fine. Here's an interesting bit. So we're talking about the mutation, like P53 mutation, right? So, but not all P53 mutations are the same. So it turns out, kind of in this tiny, tiny thing, there's like a whole fragment. And you can have mutations at different spots on the P53 gene. Am I describing this correctly?
Correct.
And even though they aren't certain, kind of why, kind of you'll get cancer. Like my brother kind of had, if you're in the same family, you have the exact same mutation. So kind of why did my brother not get cancer until he was 46 and his son, kind of at 2? Nobody still knows that. But they do know that certain of the mutations, the spots on the P53 that have mutations, like the one
Yes,
in Brazil, what is the common mutation there, it's less pernicious.
right.
It's less deadly.
That's right.
You don't get cancers. For most of those people, they don't get cancers until their 30s or 40s, where it's generally a younger age. And so they have a lot, the reason there are so many of them
Right,
in the population is that they procreate, they have a chance to procreate.
right,
So they can have children before they all die off.
right.
It's just it's a less nasty form
That's
of the
right.
mutation. Same gene, different spot on the gene.
There are 393
Spots?
spots, right? And 337 is the one in Brazil, right? And so different people have different mutations, and that gives rise to these differences. That's called, in Brazil, it's called a hypomorph. That's the less than virulent, right? Really not very bad. And that's what gave that the chance to really breed.
Yeah, right.
Also, there was no, 200 years ago, nobody traveled. Everybody married within a 1 mile radius, and
Right.
everybody was inbreeding, and there was a lot of inbreeding going on.
So a lot.
And so it really got established.
Concentration,
Yeah.
resulted in concentration. Sorry.
I have 2 questions. First, you said, it's why me? It's not you. That's unfair. Now, that judgment sounds like they do not believe probability should be the judgment criteria. And can you explain that? Why we have
why
that
some
feeling?
people say that?
No,
Why
I'm
me?
not just saying, I said we all will have that feeling. Okay? Can you explain why we have that feeling? And then I'll ask a separate question.
You want me to ask that one? Answer that one? Kind of so
Go ahead.
because I think that it's an emotional thing. Kind of we aren't. You'd like to say kind of we're all rational about everything that we do. No, kind of we're not all rational about everything we do. Kind of it may be irrational if you really understand genetics, but it's totally normal if you have suffered, kind of random pain, random suffering, to kind of wonder why me and not you. I mean, I think it's, kind of, I think you're asking, kind of in rational terms, it wouldn't be, but, kind of your emotions are strong. You can't say my feelings, I can control my feelings about this. Would you kind of?
I don't think we like to live by probability. We like to live with certainty.
And to find somebody to blame.
That's right.
If something goes wrong, we want to say it had to do with.
Cause and effect.
Yeah, right.
Right. We like cause and effect. This is probability. Every roll of the dice is random. Yeah.
Ask you a question. Do we know other animals have equivalent thing?
Oh yeah.
So that the P53 is not really the criteria that make us human.
Oh, that's correct. You're absolutely. So this is quite an old gene. It's about 800 million years old in evolution. So flies and worms and sea anemone all have P53.
So I have a chapter in the book about elephants. And a lot of research is being done about elephants. So humans have a pair or 2 pairs of P53. Elephants have 40 pairs of P53. And guess what? The incidence of cancer in elephants is very low. They have a lot more people. So if the one pair isn't working right or mutated, you have a lot others that will actually kind of go and fight the cancers. So, kind of, it just shows you kind of how important P53 is, but it is kind of
Yeah, this is a
in
random
a lot of
thing.
other species.
That's a random thing that happens. Occasionally you get an amplification of a gene, and so if it works and helps you, that's terrific. Whales, for example, which are bigger than elephants, they have 2 genes. That's just like us. But it is true that in worms and flies, for example, where it's been studied quite extensively, P53, they don't get cancer. So why do they have the gene? And that's a very interesting question. They have the gene. The gene works in their germ cells, in their eggs, and in their sperm. And what it does is it prevents changes. If it sees a change, a mutation, right? It sees DNA damage, sees change, right? It kills, right? So we like to say, a very cute way of giving the definition of the P53 gene is it ensures fidelity by death, right? Because, and that's true in cancer.
Yeah.
If a cancer arises in us that have a normal P53 gene and it sees it, it's going to kill that cell, right? And that comes from, from animals that never had cancer, right? It was really, but the fact that this gene is 800 million years old, it's only in animals, it's not in plants for some reason. And so, but the fact that it's 800 million years old tells you that this kind of fidelity was important in life for each species.
Right. Okay, so I think we're going to end here, and I'm certain that both of our guests will stay around to talk and answer questions one-on-one, and we're going to move to the book signing portion here with Labyrinth Books. Let's give a little round of applause here for a great talk.
Larry, I'm going to take my daughter and her friend out to eat.